So again, welcome everyone tonight to this meeting of the Real Group. For those of you who are new to our group, we are an advocacy group that's based here in Silicon Valley, and we focus on building bridges between twice exceptional students' parents and their educators. We're always looking for ways for parents and educators to work more effectively together to support twice exceptional learners. And I'm guessing since you're here, most of you probably know that twice exceptional learners are kids who are both very bright, creative, or have high potential in a particular area, but also experience a learning difference or disability like autism or ADHD or dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, often have a lot of anxiety because of the experiences they have in school and just feeling quite different from other kids. So we actually have two presentations coming up also on Saturday. I'll put information about that in the chat for anyone who might be interested in joining those. One is looking at neurodivergence through the female lens, and the second one is our intro to the 2 e-learner presentation for parents. And we'd love to see familiar faces there too, so please join us. And then we'll be about ready to take a little bit of a break and start planning again for our fall speaker series, but keep an eye out for other events through the summer we might host, or we might put out a survey that we'd like people to answer. So we are excited that you're here and hope that you will enjoy tonight. I will end the call and hand this over to Yael to introduce our speakers. And just a reminder to please mute and when you're not speaking, and put any of your questions in the chat. So you can see here is are the poll results. Where are you on your journey to find resources? Can everyone see those? Nope, let me share them. There you go. So looking like we have a wide array of people in different parts of their journey.
So we have two speakers tonight who are the co-founders of Parent Resource Advisors. The first one is Carmen O'Shea, and she is a former business executive, now working to build leadership and engagement in a variety of purpose-driven organizations. She's the head of communications and leadership development at Synapse School in Menlo Park, where her kids attend. Currently, she is a board member of the East Palo Alto YMCA, a community advisory board member for the Stanford Cancer Institute, and a consultant for the Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School. She is also school liaison for the Children's Health Council, the CHC in Palo Alto, and was co-chair of the school PTA last year. So she's very bored. Carmen is a graduate of Harvard College with a major in social anthropology. She was an Air Force officer for 7 years while starting her career in business. She loves to travel, learn languages, meet new people, music, and dance. Lauren Meltzer has spent most of her career helping others understand why people think and act the way they do. After earning a master's in technology and education from Harvard University, she spent over a decade working with children and parents as an educational designer and producer of educational software and websites. She served for 5 years on the board of Performing Arts Workshop, one of the oldest performing arts nonprofits for youth. She also spent a decade as a producer and host for local public radio stations KQED, KLAW, and KPFA. Simultaneously, she used interview and research skills to help consumer-based public and nonprofit companies gain consumer insights. In 2016, Lauren took a midlife gap year. While living in Malaysia with her family, she mentored a Pakistani refugee and wrote for an expat online publication. Once back in the States, she pivoted and studied coaching and energy leadership at the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. She now specializes in life transitions. She works with people who are embracing change. In 2019, she co-founded Parent Resource Advisors to help parents who are learning to embrace the joys and challenges of having neurodiverse children. Welcome, Lauren and Carmen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Callie, Yael. We really appreciate it. You guys are amazing. The resources you provide to parents and the communities here, and we're both very honored to be speaking here tonight. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Good, everybody? And yeah, so I just thought maybe we would start with quick intros about our kids, since we are probably first and foremost moms above everything else of 2 kids. So I have 2 pretty unique kiddos. I have my older child who is 12, is a trans boy. And so that has been a really unique and interesting journey over the last 5 years with him. So born a female, has been identifying as a male for 5 years. And my younger, my 11-year-old son is diagnosed with combined type ADHD, and they both test gifted. So I'm kind of in the middle of this. Oh my gosh, how do I handle all of this? And they probably, I would say, both had manifested anxiety at different times too, for different reasons. So I just remember at the start of all of this, and it goes way back with my ADHD kiddo, probably to when he was 5 or 6. I remember how overwhelming it felt, how tricky it was, thinking about all the different resources, where do I start? What do I do? And I kind of slogged my way through it. I have a bit of research orientation anyway, and so it actually helped me, I think, to get down in the middle of everything and, put together a plan of attack and have things to focus on. And so, that's one of the reasons why when I met Lauren, we decided that, hey, let's do this together. And so, Lauren, do you want to talk about your kid?
Sure.
Before
So-
you do, can Carmen, can we ask you, do you want to go into present mode so that your screen is just a little bigger? Or some people aren't
Oh,
comfortable in present
sure.
mode, so I don't want to pressure you into it.
No problem. Let's see. How do I do that?
In the upper
Oh,
right
here, I
hand
see up
corner.
at top. There we
Yeah.
go. Is that better?
Yes, much better. Now we can see
Okay.
words. Thank you. Sorry,
Sure
Lauren.
thing.
Oh, no problem. I have a almost 14, like within a week, she'll be 14-year-old. And she is she's a 2E girl. She is gifted and yet has some challenges with a lot of disses. But her ADHD is kind of the thing that is probably her main thing, and then dysgraphia probably a second. And so it's made her the kid that kind of, because of her strengths, sort of floats above the radar, or below the radar, I should say. And so for me, having to spend most of her years knowing something was up for her, knowing she had challenges, but not really having teachers see it, has been the thing that sort of made parenting a 2E kid a little challenging in the early years. And then finding the right resources for her, people that really got the 2E. So thank you so much, Real, for doing what you're doing. And then Carmen and I, we found each other when both of our kids were at Synapse, and we realized that there were so many people that were having similar journeys to us, and wouldn't it be great if we could kind of leverage our expertise based from the parenting journeys we've had, along with our research backgrounds and just love for helping parents to start parent resource advisors. And we're so excited to be able to share some tips with you today.
Absolutely. And I think in the interest of time, and because we wanted to make sure there's broad relevance to folks on the line tonight, we're just going to give you a flavor for the kinds of things to think about when you're doing research and assessing resources on your own. And we're probably, the caveat is that we're most well versed with school age kids, probably not as much with college age and beyond, although, our kids are getting there little by little. So we'll stick to general suggestions, but if anybody, is interested down the line in collaborating with us, we're also very happy to, personalize and work with you. So, okay, Lauren.
So it's interesting. When we started kind of our business, these were the kinds of things that we started to hear. And I don't know if any of this resonates with you. My son keeps complaining that he's really stupid, but we know he's not. Homework is torture. I sit and wonder every day what will really get done. Instead, she'd rather read a book, which you can do in a few days. And he doesn't have any friends, but the teachers think he's fine. And something isn't right with her, but we just can't pinpoint what. And then we would hear, what should I do?
Yeah. How do we, we want to jump in, right? Like, how do we help? And what we heard is that people are often not sure where to start, right? Or even if they should start, because a lot of times people maybe have an inkling that something's going on, but they're like, do I really get an assessment? Do I really need to go that far? How's the child going to feel about that? And I think sometimes people are also processing themselves. I mean, both Lauren and I went through some really tricky times, and honestly probably still do, about, are we doing the right thing for our child, right? Like, how do we process this? This is a challenge, right? Both kinds of E's are challenges. And sometimes honestly, you wish maybe the issues would go away. You're not sure who to trust. So yeah, there was a lot of these things that we kept hearing. We were doing it with our friend group a lot, and so we decided, all right, let's give it a whirl.
So indeed, there are many incredible resources out there, but when your child is 2E, the help for your child, then their needs can be more complex, fuzzy, or even masked by their strengths. And this is what we saw. And so where to start? So no matter how old your child is and what you think is going on, the first thing you really need to do is to be a detective, so you can really document and talk about what's happening, and documenting the challenges, but not, but also remembering the strengths, and documenting those too. And remember that you should partner with those who are seeing your child in different kinds of environments, like teachers and pediatricians. But mostly, one thing that's super important is sticking with your gut. You really know your child, and this knowledge and intuition can sometimes supersede even what you hear from specialists. So keeping some kind of journal, something, using a Word document, keeping all these notes and observations can be super, super helpful. And when you're first beginning, also, there are a lot of online learning and support groups. And, if you can just kind of keep them in mind with caution, it is a great way to kind of double check on, with other parents going through similar things, if your intuition is right and where to get ideas. But the big next step, as far as from what we see, is deciding how and where you're going to get some kind of more formal assessment. If you're going to do it as a neuropsych exam, or if it's going to come from in a more piecemeal way from schools or centers. And Carmen?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the Neuropsyc Evaluation, which you may or may not be familiar with, but this is oftentimes kind of a general nuts and bolts assessment done by a professional psychologist, usually in a team, to really look at what is going on with your child, and we'll get into what that is in a minute. But there's pros and cons, I think, to doing assessments, and based on some of the things we've seen and heard over the years, here's kind of our take on it. So I think from a positive standpoint, if you undertake an assessment for your kiddo, you can really often get the attention that you and your child needs, right? A lot of times, especially in bigger classes, their needs may really either be masked or may not be identified or recognized as such. I also think that, you have a chance to work with experts who do this for hundreds of kids, right? These people, a lot of times, this is their bread and butter. They assess and they evaluate many, many kids all the time. And I think they get then really nuanced at understanding what are the challenges that kids are facing, and is this a diagnosis? Is it not? That kind of thing. They can also answer lingering questions for you, right? And provide clarity. I think a lot of parents come to us and say, well, we just kind of feel relieved now. There's a diagnosis. There's we understand, we get it. We can go read about it. We can learn. And it may or may not normalize things a bit for you, for your families, for your friends. I also think that it can open up the door to getting support, right? So for example, insurance tends to be more likely to pay for therapy, for social support groups, that kind of thing, if there is an official diagnosis. It's also often easier, and actually Sharon probably would know this super well, to get services at school, particularly public schools, if there's a diagnosis, right? And somebody who can kind of also advocate, because a lot of times these evaluators can come in and help potentially advocate for you to get the accommodations that your child might need. So I think there's a lot of pros potentially to getting a neuropsych assessment if you're not sure what's going on and you're just really concerned about the progress or the trajectory that you see that your child is on. On the flip side, there's some negative things. So private assessments can be quite costly, right? They can really run a gamut of costs. Now, there are also assessments that are done by schools, public schools. And so those can be good in some cases. But regardless of whether, you sort of pay out of pocket or not for a private assessment, time is also a factor. It often takes a long time to get in with these folks, and then it takes a long time to get through the assessment, and it may take a long time to even receive the report, months in some cases. And meanwhile, you're waiting, right, for the diagnosis and the recommendations and so forth. I also think, we've heard some parents, and I remember going through this myself, feeling a little concerned that somehow, if you have that diagnosis or you have the label, it will maybe stigmatize your child a little bit or your family. And in the case of my younger son, we were worried about him feeling a little victimized. It's like, and we actually debated for a long time, do we tell him he has ADHD or not, right? I mean, clearly the school in our case needed to know, but it was this discussion around, do we explicitly get the diagnosis, and then do we explicitly share that diagnosis with our kiddo and with kind of our broader network and ecosystem. I also will say, as much as I wish it weren't the case, there are definitely some private schools out there that don't really want to accept kids who have challenges or perceived challenges from their point of view. They can pick and choose, right? And so sometimes if there's a diagnosis, we get a lot of people asking us, well, I'm applying to this private school or that private school. Should I, what should I do? Should I tell them? Should I disclose? And I mean, it's sort of up in the air. I always have, just in the interest of wanting to be transparent and rather knowing the issues up front than having to address them later. But that is something to consider. And then finally, I think, it's important to think about whether getting the diagnosis is absolutely necessary at this point in time, right? Because, for example, in some cases, you as parents, back to that, instinct that Lauren talked about, you may have a feeling that there are some challenges. Maybe there are social issues, there's a little hyperactivity, there's sensory issues. There are things you can do, right, and steps you can take without necessarily getting the full evaluation done. So, and they can be addressed in parallel or even at a later point. So just those are some things to consider. So if you do go the route of the assessment, what does it look like, right? So it's a multi-step process. Oops, sorry. And it generally consists of a couple of steps. So usually the assessor will conduct a pretty extensive parent interview, a child observation at home, sometimes at school. They'll do child testing, usually IQ testing is part of that if it hasn't already been done. There's questionnaires that are completed by parents and teachers. Kind of a comprehensive written report is what you get at the end with any applicable diagnoses, and then a recommendation, a set of recommendations for next steps, and as well as potential providers. And usually the evaluator will have a post-assessment discussion with the parents to kind of a readout and say, here's what's going on. So, there are definitely things to think through as part of that process, tips to think about, ways to prepare to ensure that you have sort of the most thorough and effective experience. As I mentioned before, cost can really run the gamut, especially for private assessments. Sometimes insurance will pay, sometimes they won't, sometimes you have to fight. Some places actually don't take, as in a lot of places here in the Bay Area, don't take insurance. So then by definition, it's going to be covered as an out-of-network expense only at some portion. Some providers, a handful like the Children's Health Council, for example, will offer sliding scale payment options for evaluations and even in some cases for ongoing therapy. So that's something to consider. As I mentioned before, the scheduling can take a long time, especially at certain times of the year, end of summer, fall, all of that, right? As you're heading back to school, you're watching the kid go through the first month or two and struggle in school, tend to get really booked up. So getting time with them, going through the process, all of that takes time. And then another thing to note is that some professionals and clinics offer just evaluation services. So it's kind of the main thing they do is evaluate. And then others, especially the bigger conglomerates like the Children's Health Council, Sutcliffe is another one, Sutcliffe Pediatrics. They may offer the assessment, but then they also would offer ongoing therapy. So something to think about is, hey, do I want to go to a place that's maybe more of a one-stop shop and I might be able to get some therapeutic help afterwards from the same place, or do I do this in two different places? I would say, and this is sort of super generalization, so apologies if anybody has had different experiences, but in my experience, Private pay generally tends to be a little bit more comprehensive, and I think kind of therapeutic focused, like broad scale, than school-based assessments. It's not to say the school-based assessments can't be very accurate and very helpful, they can. But in my experience, the school is really trying to direct that experience and contextualize it to the school environment, right? Because that's where the kid is showing up and they're working with them. And so it's maybe sometimes a little bit less soup to nuts than some of the private assessments might be. But again, totally depends on the school, on the provider, on the, on the kid. Okay.
So
Oops.
We're gonna go through and mute everyone.
So we want to try to sprinkle some real live situations in, people that we've worked with, and just to give you a little more color in terms of what we're saying. And I wanted to share with you about a girl that I met a few years back who was going to a public middle school, and her parents were noticing some emotional dysregulation, and the dad was pretty convinced that he was just seeing normal puberty girl, like she's going to grow out of it. This is what it is. The mom had a different opinion, and she was pretty sure that there was something else going on. And, they were a little concerned about, should we put money into this or not? But in the end, first they decided they would just go to the school because they were able to get an evaluation through the school. And while they didn't think it was academically related, they were able to have her sort of assess from the emotional regulation perspective and to see if she would indeed qualify for a 504 or IEP. And the school came back with that she had ADHD, and so seemed great, except some of her actions kept seeming like a little bit more. And the mom had been on some sites and looking at reading articles and was just not sure she had the whole full story. And so she ended up going and getting a neuropsych exam with a psychologist who knew a lot about girls. And indeed, what the final diagnosis was that there was some ADHD, but there was also some autism. And that was what they were seeing. And that explained a ton. And it was super helpful to have that, even though I think they were both a little concerned at first about the stigma and how their 12-year-old would take this, because it's still, autism still is kind of a loaded word, even though they're learning so much of what it is and what it isn't. And how it actually is a really positive thing. It shows as a very positive thing in a lot of ways for girls. But they actually found that once they were armed with this, it was super helpful in terms of getting her the right help, the right way that they could position this. And as she went through high school, she just really started loving herself and really kind of grew with it. So I just thought that was a really nice story, and seeing how the different kinds of assessment was able to kind of pave the way for her in this case. Go ahead.
Terrific. So here we are. So now you're either post-assessment, or maybe you decided not to do one for the moment. So the question is, what comes next? So a lot of things we hear are, for example, in Lauren's case, there may be more than one diagnosis, right, in the story that she mentioned. So if there's more than one diagnosis, where do you start? Do you try to tackle it all at once? With choice exceptional kids, as I'm sure many of you know, sometimes the gifted part may come as a bit of a surprise, or maybe the extent of the giftedness comes as a surprise, or the way it's manifesting. So do you address that in addition to the challenges part of the other E? As I mentioned before, do you look at one place, or do you try to find the best fit provider for every specific need that the child has, based on chemistry, based on best fit, based on accessibility, that kind of thing? So there's definitely a trade-off between convenience versus precision, and really finding a fit for your child. It also may depend on what's a priority for you. So for example, we've seen a lot of people place a priority on finding providers, either behaviorists or therapists, who are really good at being able to advocate for the child and the family with the school, for example. And by that, it's, they're willing to sit down and work on work on accommodations, help the school, if it's public, understand, is it a 504, is it an IEP? If so, like, what are the specific lists of things that they're going to do? In some cases, like at one point we had a behaviorist who would actually help coach the teacher on specific things that helped. You know, at one point, I think when my kid was young, they even had like a walkie-talkie kind of system going where, and of course the teacher has to be open to that. It depends on the teacher, but you know, if that's a real priority, then that might be what you want to focus on, right? Or what you're looking for in a provider and an ongoing therapist. It's also important through all of this to look at, help besides just the therapy. There, a lot of times support groups can be helpful, both for the children and for sure for the parents, right? The whole concept of taking care of your own mental health needs and your own anxiety and stress in this whole process, cannot be kind of stressed enough, because it's challenging, right? And it's difficult, and it's difficult in the best of years, never mind, pandemic year. So I think, looking at that, looking at online resources, all of these things, sometimes people are local and they're happy to go local. Other times they say, well, we've kind of gotten used to this Zoom thing now. We just want to find the best fit therapist, even if it means that it has to be on Zoom. So, local or not is something to potentially consider as well. So, and I think we've talked about this before, time of year, whether or not there are waiting lists. One way of getting around this to some extent, and we've counseled, clients to do this in the past, is just parallel process it, right? So if there's 2 or 3 therapists that you think might be the right fit, reach out to them, figure out what their availability looks like, keep checking in. If they say no, or they say not right now, but my caseload may decrease a little in a couple months, put that on your calendar and check in with them, right? It's sort of like she who asks or he who asks is gonna get responded to. So, these are all things to consider when you're going to take action. So we'd like to just shift gears for a second and maybe talk through some of the exceptionalities that may come up, and maybe that some of your kids are demonstrating as well, and just some things to think about or take away based on our own kids, experience with our own kids and with some of our clients. So the first one is around giftedness, right? So all of you, all of you have 2A kids. Clearly giftedness / being super bright is going to be a given. And I think, interestingly, giftedness sometimes shows up across multiple domains and across the board, but more often than not shows up asynchronously, right? So the child is super ahead of the curve in a particular area, like math or verbal reasoning, maybe processing speed, memory, etc., and then is falling behind in something else. And interestingly, with a lot of our clients, what we're finding is, or what they tell us is, my kid actually tests average or even above average, but because the gap between the average and the crazy out here, right, that you see in another domain is so big, it actually feels like a deficit to my child, even though it's not, right? And so that perception and handling that perception is something important to consider. We also, it's interesting, I think, here to focus on, to say, well, do we focus on the giftedness? I think it's too often it's easy to just jump to addressing the challenges. And while that may be absolutely critical and important, it's also important to focus on the strengths and lead with the strengths, as we've heard before, and figure out if the kid does this amazingly well, that's awesome. Let's commend them for that. Let's make them feel good, right? Because a lot of times esteem issues, right, come into all of this. So I have an example of a client that we worked with who is a highly gifted boy, especially in math, struggling socially and behaviorally in traditional kind of private school. And he ended up moving to a twice exceptional school, the Burkhardt School, some people may be familiar with, and thriving. There's therapists on campus there. It allows his gifts to shine. So, there's a lot of things to think through when you're addressing the giftedness question. The school question is a big one, clearly, and it's on a lot of parents' mind. It's like, where, to what extent do we need to change the environment to fit the kid versus working with the kid to fit the environment? So that's definitely something to think about. Differentiation, this is another one. I don't know if any of you all are feeling this as well, but this concept of, okay, when my kid is ahead of the pack in something, how do you honor that? How do you challenge them? Because I don't know about you guys, but a lot of times if my kid, especially my ADHD kid, is not challenged, so if that side of him is not fed, it actually makes the ADHD worse. He can't focus, he gets bored more easily, you know, whereas if he has something to attend to and he's having to focus and he's feeling challenged, you know, mentally and academically, it's less generally. So differentiation can look different, right? Especially in different school environments. So for example, in some traditional private schools, you may actually get some individual differentiation, right? Or group differentiation. So you may be high, medium, low, although they're not called that. They're usually color coded or something else, right? Like a math group or a reading group or something like that. In schools that are a little bit non-traditional, Synapse is one where Anna's, Lauren's child and my kids go. Synapse actually, the way that they differentiate is by going deep. So they don't necessarily give the kid a lot of extra work. They say, if you've already done this, show us how you can do it another way, like go deeper, explore in this area. And so they can actually do that in parallel with multiple kids and handle it that way. But they can do that because there's two teachers, you know, in a classroom with maybe 15 or 20 kids. And so that kind of thing might be possible. Then there are for sure extensions, right? At any kind of school, as well as in homeschooling, there's all sorts of extensions and ways of, you know, continuing to bring the knowledge and keep the child engaged. And I will say in public school, obviously we are all probably familiar with the fact that in the elementary school, there's not a whole lot of like a formal differentiation until middle school, and particularly math in middle school. But I do think it's really highly dependent on the teacher. My fourth grader who was in public school last year in Menlo Park had a great teacher, and she was really, you know, was able to finesse sort of, you know, allowing him to go a little further, or maybe picking him to when she saw him getting kind of squirmy and antsy, having him come up and read something to the class. So she was differentiating kind of on the gifted part and also preemptively on some of the challenges part. And I think so much of that can go back to your advocacy as a parent, and then also your partnership, right, with the specialists and the experts and the therapists who can help advocate for you and with you. So those are just some things to consider. And then finally, we look at different types of giftedness and how it shows up, right? So for example, in the classroom in particular, a child can have absolutely brilliant verbal reasoning and, you know, the vocabulary of a 20-year-old, but if they're a slower processor, even relative to their verbal abilities, it may not be as much a challenge in the classroom because they need the time to think through it, and maybe they would take it home and think about it or go more deeply. The example of my older child, so my older child is a little bit of an inch deep and a mile wide, and processes extremely fast. And so he gets bored. He doesn't really want to go deep. He's just like done something and then wants to go on to the next. And so we worked with his teacher to kind of say, all right, when he finishes something, can you have 3 more things ready to give him? And, you know, and just kind of keep him engaged. And we did that because he was coming home saying, Mom, I'm bored. Like I already did that, or I wrote the story and I even iterated on the story and now I need something else. So, you know, just keep in mind that the way the giftedness shows up and like what domain it's in is going to really make a difference, right? In terms of what you might want to do in the classroom or even at home. And also just please don't forget, right, that giftedness can show up in many domains outside just the strictly intellectual one. So it can aesthetically, musically, emotionally, to name a few, right? There are children who are just amazing in so many different spheres of their lives. So we need to find ways to honor this, right, as parents, and for sure at home, in addition to at school. And the key, I think, is just remembering that asynchronous development is normal. It's okay. Let's, you know, continue to let them lead from their strengths. And I think Callie would probably agree. It's pretty key at some point, whether even if it's not in school, at some point trying to get them around their peers, right, from their intellectual peers, whether it's an after school activity or an online class or whatever it is, so that in some context they feel excited about things. Okay, so sorry, let's see. Okay, so the next area is sort of social challenges, and I specifically don't say ASD, right, autism spectrum disorder, because I think that one of the key points in this area is that social challenges are not automatically equatable, right, to ASD. Sometimes it is, sometimes they are, but they could be a function of ADHD. It shows up differently sometimes for ADHD kids. It could be a function of personality, like introversion. Could be a function of anxiety, you know, connected to that. It could be a function of processing, right? If you're a slow processor or not hearing correctly, it stands to reason that you may not engage socially as productively as you would otherwise. So sometimes you have to really tease it out. And this is sometimes where the neuroassessment, back to the assessment area, may come in handy. For groups, social skills groups, there's just a wealth of information and choices in this area. Really, lots of different providers offer this. The Michelle Garcia winner, sort of social thinking, is one really, you know, well-known set of social skills development. But there's also there's different ones, and it also depends on what are you trying to help the child with, and sort of what is the philosophy in these things. So for an example, there's another group that we worked with called Developmental Pathways for Kids in Redwood City, and their focus was on what they call integrated play groups. The whole idea there in a nutshell is you take your novice learner, your child with social challenges, and you pair them with sort of neurotypical learners in a facilitated way, and they're learning from the neurotypical learners and kids. Then there are other iterations of groups where you're actually, you maybe have multiple kids with social challenges facilitated together. So it sort of depends on what you're looking for, what you're wanting out of it. Again, the fit and sort of the chemistry with the facilitator. And there's just a lot of really good choices locally. Then there's also individual therapy, right? So especially for things like pragmatic speech deficits, where you're having a hard time, that the child is having a hard time using language appropriately in social situations or taking perspective. A lot of online resources that you can leverage for both parents and children in this area. And of course, this is sometimes where behavior therapy may come in handy, right? So is there parent directed or your parent therapy, where parents can actually learn to engage with their children and help reinforce some of what they're learning with the therapist at home, maybe sort of helping facilitate a play date, for example, maybe even bringing in friends and family members, right, to help with this as well. And the idea is also to bring in teachers for support, bring in, you know, your therapist team to the table at school if you need help there. So yeah, so that's sort of some of the things that we look at from a social challenges standpoint. And there are tips about, you know, where to find these places, what to ask, how to work with therapists productively, how you can keep learning as a parent, etc. Okay, let me just check. Are there questions in the chat here?
There will be questions, but nothing.
Okay.
You guys.
Okay, you guys, please feel free to stop me if you have like a burning question or need me to pay attention to the chat. Okay. So next area, this one's near and dear to my heart. So ADHD, lots to say here. So one big question that we get a lot from parents, it's kind of almost the first thing out of people's mouth is, should I give my kid medicine or not, right? Like if you've got the ADHD diagnosis, if so, like when do I do it? What kind of medicine? For this, I think it's really important to consider working with a psychiatrist. In fact, the psychiatrists are the only ones who are actually, psychiatrists and pediatricians are the ones who are able to prescribe the medicines. And oftentimes, if you do medicine, the psychiatrist is a different person than the ongoing therapist / psychologist. So there are people who kind of just do medicine management, psychiatric medicine management for ADHD in some cases. And this is important. For example, with my son, we went through 4 different kinds of medicines over about 2 years before we settled on his current one, which is a little kinder, gentler on him, and where he really felt like he was still himself, just able to focus better, right, and sort of attend to his feelings and regulate himself better. So it takes a while to really understand the nuances of the medicine. And honestly, we sort of relied on our pediatrician probably for a little too long, and the pediatrician was amazing in every other realm, but sometimes this takes nuances, right? Our psychiatrist, we went there, and the first time we were talking to him, he's like, whoa, you've tried medicines in that class, okay, but there's this whole other class or these other things to think about. You've only scratched the surface. And we breathed a sigh of relief, like, okay, we're gonna find the right one. So that's something to really think about. Executive functioning, right? So there's also CBT, cognitive behavior therapy with ADHD, But I think in many cases, almost more important is this concept of executive function. So how does the child organize themselves in all their different realms, right? Emotionally, academically, interpersonally, especially as middle school starts to hit, right? Like what are they doing? How do they handle all of these different assignments and teachers and Schoology, this and that? It gets a little overwhelming. I mean, it's overwhelming for any of us, but particularly for kids who are a little behind in their executive functioning. And, you know, a lot of times people will say that one of the main deficits of ADHD is sort of an executive function deficit, that the brain development is just a couple of years behind in many cases. And sometimes it catches up and sometimes it doesn't. Some people, you know, end up having ADHD for life, but thankfully, there are a lot of really good workarounds and tools that people can bring to bear here. So there's EF coaches, executive function coaches. There's a lot of online resources. There's maybe even some specific schools when it comes to ADHD, although I will say when we went through the process locally, most of the specialist schools tended to either focus on social challenges, so maybe Asperger's and autism, and or language-based learning differences, so dyslexia oriented schools, that kind of thing. Not so much ADHD. And it's tricky because sometimes in ADHD there's a behavioral component, right? So if anything, that you need the help from the school to kind of manage the behavior at school and at home. So that's something to think about. And public school, honestly, my younger one ended up in public school for several years successfully with scaffolding, right? With a 504 plan, with you know, plenty of accommodations, plenty of, you know, like texting and back and forth between me and the teacher. I signed it to be room parent. It helped. So, you know, and also social things can look different, as I mentioned before, in ADHD. There can be blurting. The kids are putting their foot in their mouth with what they're saying, right? They're oversharing. They may be getting too close and personal, like distance wise, to friends. So it's really finding the kinds of therapists and resources that can address the ADHD specific challenges, whether they're social or executive function or something else. And the last point I'll make on this is that sometimes ADHD can show up really differently in boys versus girls, right? This sort of stereotype of more of the dreamy, inattentive girl versus the hyper whirling dervish of a boy. I mean, it's not always that way, but oftentimes it does show up, at least in part, that way. So there's some things like mindfulness and others that you know that may help and contribute to this, but just there's a lot of things that have to be looked at when considering this diagnosis. Lauren? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Another area that a lot of TUI kids have deal with is sensory challenges. And sensory challenges can range from just excitabilities to sensory processing disorder, which is where there's actually a traffic jam in the brain, or just highly sensitive children. And in all of these cases, what you have is that different senses they're either oversensitive or undersensitive. They're either seekers or they it's avoiders in terms of sensory challenges. And it's in all these cases, there's a lot that you can do as a parent, as well as getting help from the outside. Occupational therapists are like the first line of defense in terms of getting outside resources. And basically, with an occupational therapist, they can help you regulate and calm senses through activities and weighted, comfortable, secure areas, and get them to able to focus more. Things like brushing, weighted sensory integration, all these kinds of things will be really helpful with the support of an occupational therapist. And generally, children will go once or twice a week once they start working with a therapist, and they'll also give you activities that you can do at home that will help your child. There are also a lot of support groups for parents. The Parent Place is a great place to find support groups for parents, and they will also give you kind of tips along the way that can help you. And environmental adaptations are super important too. A lot of times with these kids, these sensitivities will cause them a lot of anxiety. with my daughter, little things that, we talked at the beginning about being a detective, like looking for their triggers. My daughter was really sensitive to wind on her face. And so we learned early on that we couldn't just like throw her in the back of a bike or on a bike ride and expect her to have a good time. And it wasn't the biking, it was the wind on her face. But each child is going to be different. And so kind of figuring out what their triggers are will be super helpful for them and for you. A lot of times there will be some, and I'll get this in the next slide too, you might want to, self-esteem can be impacted, and also just anxiety when it comes to sensory challenges. And so you might want to explore that, and I'll get to that more in the next slide. And then there's also a lot of different kinds of products that you can find online. Things like chewy, for some of these kids, they need to chew on things. For my daughter, it was her clothes for years, but they do have chewy plastic things that they can chew on, and it won't impact, it will be very, it'll give them a lot of relief, and it will give you a lot of relief because you won't have holes in their clothes. And as well as I mentioned, brushing, which for some kids, the actual brushing of their skin can help calm them, and you can get the proper brushes online too. I want you to go on, Carmen.
Sure.
And as we've referred to with all the, all the issues that come with having a 2E kid, mental health sort of is comorbid with a lot of other things. And the good news is there are a lot of ways to get help. Both in school, there are a lot of times there's school therapists. There's also places as Carmen referred to the CHC, which has a lot of different kinds of therapists, and then there's individual therapists. There are supports, one-on-one supports for older kids, but also groups. And this can be really helpful for teens or older kids that want to have like more of a social aspect to it. And then of course there's parenting support, which is important as part of the therapy. I think that from our experience, there's some people are shy away from therapy for two reasons. First of all, they think that there might be a stigma attached to it. And the other is the cost. And, we won't lie, in the Bay Area, therapy can be very expensive, but there are ways to get sliding scales. There are places like CHC, as Carmen mentioned, that do have sliding scales. And also I think you can, when you're talking to therapists, you can find out if they have a sliding scale. And then the other thing in terms of stigma, I think that's kind of an old way of thinking about it. I think nowadays people realize it's just as important as going to the doctor for a skin knee. Really can push that idea behind if you had ever thought about that. One thing that's also really helpful is finding the right therapist. And most therapists will allow a 15-minute free interview to get a sense for if there's a good fit. And we really encourage our clients to take advantage of that. And also to make sure that they don't just settle for the one person that was recommended to them, because again, it's so much of it is just chemistry and fit. And also the last thing, just in regards to finding the right person, there are people that actually are aware of the 2E kid, and they can really see your child in a way that just other therapists can't. And so finding people and interviewing for them, making sure that they have worked with kids that are twice exceptional, will really help you and your child save a lot of time and angst, because there can even be bad diagnoses because things that show up for 2E kids is different than, can be perceived as something like OCD, when it's actually just something that is a symptom of certain kinds of autism, for example. And then, I mean, one thing that we wanted to make sure we mentioned is that not everyone hits it right the first time, and it's very common for people to switch therapists. And so making sure that you go in knowing that this might take place also. Go ahead.
Okay. Did I skip a slide, Lauren?
I think we did. Learning.
I feel like I'm slipping a slide, yeah, or skipping a slide.
Yeah,
there, sorry. Yeah.
So learning differences. You know, there are so many different learning differences, and and in terms of how you approach getting resources for your child, you can take it from many different angles. I mean, the first is, depending on the learning difference your child has, school choice. And as Carmen mentioned, there are places like Armstrong School or Athena Academy, which focuses on language, like dyslexia. And they're also, I think with Athena Academy, it is a 2E school also, but you don't have to go to a school like that to get support. Many schools will also offer accommodations, and depending on if you're going with the public or private schools, if you're going to public schools, it's just a matter of, doing the 504 or IEP to get the school accommodations. With the private school, you don't have that, but with private schools, it's super important that you ahead of time explore if they have learning therapists, if they have learning support, and how much they actually will use to support your child in addition to classroom accommodations, and how much they just assume that if you need more than that, you really shouldn't be there. I think that, we talked about if you should, share the learning differences with your school if you're applying. And I think Carmen and I both have found that it's more helpful if the school really is going to turn down your child because of it, it probably isn't the right place for them. And it can make such a huge difference to feel understood for these kids, to feel that they are understood, that they that it's okay to learn slightly differently, and that the school will know that it doesn't mean that they're stupid, it just means that they learn differently. The kind of accommodations that my daughter went to Keys in her first 3 years, and one of the things I loved about their accommodations was they put them out for everyone. So if it wasn't like they were pulled out of class, they sometimes were, but they also brought therapists in that would help with a group of students. And so it was very nice. It was a nice, gentle way for kids with learning differences to feel like they were getting what they needed, but weren't singled out. The next thing I want to talk about in addition to school is the kind of academic support that you can get outside of school. And one difference that I don't think everyone understands is there are tutors who specialize in learning differences, and they're called educational specialists. And these kinds of tutors are people that really help your kid learn what they didn't quite understand. In a way that is taking into account their learning style. They really understand different kinds of learning differences that other kinds of tutors who are just helping maybe your kid learn different skills might not. And so again, just as I mentioned with mental health specialists, it's really important to do a little research when you're trying to find a tutor and not just go on a recommendation, but instead figure out, does this person really understand the way your child learns? We have used, for my daughter, we had used some math tutors, and we really struck gold, and sometimes we really didn't, because the teacher just did not understand how to teach to someone who has ADHD and dysgraphia. And those two things, when it comes to math, make a huge difference, because you don't want someone who's going to give them tons of written work if they have those different things. They just don't have the focus, and in dysgraphia, they can't, writing is harder. But what my daughter did need was someone that could teach her how to take her, the way she was doing all the thinking in her brain because writing was hard, and how to make her learn how to do that with writing, but in a structured way that most kids wouldn't even think about. Now, as we also mentioned with learning differences, one thing that you also want to think about is the just the anxiety that can come with it. And keeping an eye on that is super important, because it's self-esteem is can be one of the unfortunate things, a low self-esteem that comes with learning differences. But if nipped in the bud, it can actually make a big difference if you get some support with the anxiety. And then the other thing that I think is super important to keep in mind is that these kids aren't the diagnosis, they're diagnosis. And they have challenges, but they are not the diagnosis. And keeping that in mind and helping them with the challenges, but also keeping in mind their strengths is super important when you're considering resources with learning differences. So.
Great. All right, let me just zip through the last chart or two, and then we'd love to take questions if people have them. So just sort of quickly on the topic of gender nonconformity, which is another one that I have a fair amount of knowledge on after a couple years of the process with my child. It's really a journey. That's the whole concept of it being a spectrum is absolutely true, especially for this generation. I think there's something about this generation where they just get that it's more fluid and it's not binary. And so there's very much of a difference sometimes between somebody's sex that's assigned at birth, their identity that they feel, their gender identity, the way they express that gender identity in the world. So how they dress, how they show up, how they act, and then their sexual orientation. Sometimes people conflate and mix all those things up, but they can actually be very different things. And it's important to kind of honor that with the child. And I think also important to note is that kiddos who are non-conforming actually experience much higher rates of all sorts of mental health issues and distress, and even suicidal ideation, very sadly. So it's really important to listen and not dismiss their concerns. And I think most crucially is just to show up and be supportive. When these kids have the nuclear family support, they actually have normal rates of all of these challenges. When they do not have that support, or they have the opposite of that support, that's when the issues really arise. And I think by the same token, though, it's important to say, and I mean, I've learned this over the years, you can't just sort of blindly go along with everything that the kid wants in that particular moment, because it takes time to unfold, right? It is a journey. And one of the things that therapists or anybody in this world is really looking for when they think about, is it a stage versus is this truly like a persistent identity, is the very concept of persistence, insistence, right? Is the child really insisting on this, and consistency. And especially as they get older, it's not easy to be this different in the world, right? I mean, and they get that even at 10, 12, 14, 16. So if they are showing persistence and consistency around this, there's something going on there truly, right? And we need to show up and sort of support them. There are a number of things to consider when you're going through the gender journey, from, what's inherent or involved in social transitioning. There are legal challenges and implications that sometimes would be addressed. For example, name, pronoun changes, gender changes. There are medical interventions, even starting at puberty, as to whether or not you block the natal puberty, whether you move on to cross-sex hormone surgery. There's all sorts of things to consider in the journey of helping them make their outward appearance more concordant with the identity that they feel is authentically them. And, for some kids, they want to change a lot. For some kids, they don't have to change anything, and they're just happy to show up and identify the way they are. So it's important to not presume or lead them too much in this, but sort of take their lead at every step and just sort of be there. And I will say, having personally gone through this, parents and loved ones really have to work through their own process. It's not easy. There's often a sense of loss and grief in different ways. There's also kind of persistent questions, particularly when you have children who are younger, about whether or not to share it and what the consequences could be of doing so. could be shocking if you haven't shared it and somebody finds out in an untoward way. On the other hand, you know, it may, you know, kids may not be able to be stealth, or they may not have any choice, depending on whether they've decided to take on a different identity and live as a different identity in the same environment as they've always been, right? School-wise, community-wise. So these are just some considerations to think about if your child is exhibiting any of these signs, or talking to you about you know, not feeling comfortable in their own skin, or wanting to explore any of these themes. So that was sort of the last exceptionality we wanted to cover, and just sort of to leave you with here, just some important questions in general, right? So I think key is to remember that this is a process. It's a process for you, it's a process for your kids, it's a process for the people surrounding you, and that you should get the help that you need as parents, and also adapt as the child evolves. It may look different year to year, it may look even different month to month, what the child needs, right, and what you need to do. Usually on the question of evaluations, sometimes schools will want you to do them maybe every 3 years to have them kind of be refreshed, and to make sure that they're able to accommodate and address the child's needs in the most current way and the most effective way. Some schools actually have specific tests, like a NUEVA is one, for example, an IQ test that the child would take to actually even be considered to be admitted or not. Whether to be admitted, it's part of the admissions process. But I think the net here is that there are lots of resources from the teachers in the schools, individual therapists, evaluator folks, online support groups, parent groups. For example, I'm on a couple of private gender-oriented Facebook groups for local, families going through this that can be very helpful. So what's important, I think, is to consider, what do you want to prioritize as the parent? What do you think is going to give you the most impact and really help your child the most? If you can't do it all at once, that's okay. It's okay to be sequential about it. It's okay to do it in parallel too, if that's what you're more comfortable with. Just kind of be open and flexible as their journey unfolds, to be there with them, right? And help them discover it and support them. And maybe lastly, to also think about how you best absorb, consume, right, information and advice. Some people want to read it all online. That was me. Like, I just got much information as I could and talked to as many people as I could and then put it together in my head. Other people maybe would like a little bit more hand-holding. Other people would just sort of like their doctor to say, here's what you need to do, here's where you need to go. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. So just think about how you are best able to consume the information and learn what you need to do to support your kiddo. So with that, we are totally happy to take questions. And I will also say, neither Lauren nor I, as you can probably tell by our backgrounds, is a medical professional in any way, shape, or form, or a psychological professional. We are parents, and we are parents who have spent a lot of time and effort and sweat and tears, like going through this process for our own children. And we care a lot about trying to share our learnings and help others out as best as we can. We're sort of both driven that way. So, just want people to know that we would never try to make an evaluation, make a diagnosis, tell you what to do or where to go. It's all about just saying, hey, here's some thoughts. This might be helpful. Here's a little bit of coaching. Here's some resource ideas. And we'll leave it at that. So what questions do you guys have for us?
Well, Carmen,
and thank you again so much, Yael and Kelly.
Yes, I was just curious. Can you tell us about because there's so many amazing questions here. What does Parent Resource Advisor do to help people navigate through this?
Sure. Lauren, do you want to take it? Because I've been yapping for a while. You're on mute, I think.
So what we do is we meet with people, we meet with parents that generally they're either at the beginning of their journey or they're at a crossroads. And sometimes they have a diagnosis, sometimes they don't. And they kind of are like, where do I start? Where should we go from here? And we listen to what's going on with their child, what's going on with their family, what is kind of the best ways, as Carmen said, for them to take in information. And we come up with a curated resource list for them that meets exactly what their child is needs. And then we work with the family either in a coaching relationship or as things come up in their journey. We continue to work with them. We have different kinds of packages. Sometimes people just need a one-off. Sometimes they want to work with us for a couple months until they're set with getting their child settled. And Carmen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that sums it up. Yeah, we're very flexible in terms of how people want to work with us. And some people come to us and they don't have a lot of money to spend, and that's okay. We're not trying to break anyone's bank. And if they just want an hour or two of, hey, here's some ideas, let's put together a resource list for me in terms of where I can start, like what are the top 3 things I need to do, or who are the, what are some ideas of therapists in this particular domain or space that I should start with, we can do that. All the way to Lauren's actually a certified coach, so she, we can also do some ongoing. She can do some ongoing coaching as well if people like that.
Carmen, can we suggest that you stop screen sharing so we can see everyone? And
thank you. How's that?
One of the questions that's coming up, and Anne, I am going to circle back to your original questions, but one of the questions that's coming up a lot is, what are resources if you don't have time or money? Or if you have time but no money, and just because things are so expensive. And so, I'd love you to answer that. I mean, I would like to just throw in 2 things that come to mind immediately. One is, obviously, if someone wants to join our real email group, a lot of times, you can put your questions out there, you can ask for advice, you can get directed to resources. So I really recommend, if you're not part of our real resource group, real Gmail group, that you join that. I can put the link, either Yael or I can put that in the link in the chat later. And then I was going to say exactly what Sharon said, in terms of parents helping parents, and especially, Anne, I know you have an older child that you're working with, and there's a parent support group that I'll post in the chat that is actually for parents of kind of neurodivergent older teens and young adults. And that's a free group that might be able to support you as well. So I turn it over to Carmen and Lauren, any other ideas you have on sort of free or low cost?
I think I'm noticing that people are listing them, and the Parents Helping Parents is a great one, and then also there's different kinds of websites that you can go to, like Understood. Tilt Parenting is wonderful. They have a list of thousands, actually hundreds of podcasts on different subjects, which are great. And they also have, you can be part of their community. Bright and Quirky gives, all these things are very low price. They're like $40 a month. If you can do it for free also. Carmen, do you want to add some things?
Yeah, I'm putting in the chat here too. The CH Children's Health Council has free support groups, caregiver support groups for any number of these diagnoses or exceptionalities. So they have a sensory processing one, ADHD, social skills, I believe, mental health, and you can just show up and you can have a chance to chat with other people. They're led by parents, and yeah, I think there's a lot of good things that you can educate yourselves on. And somebody mentioned it, but if there's a particular domain, there's a number of organizations that are going to be affiliated with that particular topic, and you can definitely do a lot of this research on your own.
And so then Anne had also asked a question to me directly that I don't think came up in the chat, and I'm going to try to summarize it, and I'll do the best I can. But this happens quite a lot is with twice exceptional dyslexic kids or dysgraphic kids. They don't, especially dyslexic. I mean, but this happened with Anne's child too, dysgraphia. Things just don't get picked up. The kids are they fall in a gap, where they're, it's masking in a way. We know that the gifts can mask the differences and the differences can mask the gifts, right? There's like a gap between, like, if you could qualify for the gifted or honors program, or if you can qualify for special ed and you don't, no one sees that you need both, right? You kind of fall in the middle. And I gave Anne a few ideas about resources for supporting her son, who's now in college, around this topic. I'll have to go back and see what I direct messaged her, but Yes, Anne, you had asked about the IDES. They're the ones who wrote about the strengths of dyslexia. They're a very good resource. I just didn't know, Carmen and Lauren, if you had any other really great resources for older kids, you know, who find out late that they have these conditions.
Mhm.
No, that's not really our area of expertise. The Summit Center is kind of known for their ability to tease out the dyslexia. They call it stealth dyslexia. And so they might be a good source for older kids, Summit Center.
I was trying to go back through and see what I had. I know I had some good recommendations because it is really, it's tough. I recommended like reaching out to Dr. Marcy Schwartz, who does Thrive College Counseling, because she helps kids with learning differences find college counselors. I also recommended the Schwab Learning Center at Stanford, because they work with students on campus who have dyslexia and ADHD.
I can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, Sharon, I don't know if you have some other good resources.
Well, it's not just a resource. I think this is exactly why a good assessment is absolutely necessary. And I think making sure that the good assessment, the one that is, you know, often, yes, expensive, is going to be done before, junior year in, high school. It's really necessary because it will guide you to understand you and your child, how the brain is actually functioning, what are the needs, what are the strengths. And according to that, you find the college that can provide you the support that your child needs. So you could set them up for success. Also, in every college, there is a disability resource center of some sort. And once there is an assessment and there is an official, diagnosis, then they will give you accommodations. And knowing how to navigate within the college is important. And there are coaches and educational therapists and psychologists that can help you figure out the way to do that. So this is just like one of the examples why I believe that an in-depth assessment is necessary at some point. Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be when the child is 5, but at some point you do want to make sure that you have those, understanding that can really guide you toward acceptance. That's the first thing, just acceptance. Self and by the parents, and then some accommodation that can support you in your success in however way that you define success. It's not just about grades.
Yeah, and I actually listened to a presentation today from Stanford Neurodiversity Project given by an entrepreneur who's dyslexic, who has started publishing comic books about a range of topics. And his point was, at some point, you just start doing what brings you joy in your learning, even if you know your grades aren't going to be all that great. And then it was interesting. He said he actually did better once he started changing all of his assignments into comic books. He learned so much more. It was very, very interesting. But I also I said to Anne, because I think it's easy for parents to start beating up on themselves, because so often with twice exceptional kids, we don't figure things out until they're older. It's so easy to beat up on yourself. And I just want to reassure parents that, I mean, it happens. It is not your fault. Do not blame yourself, because it's hard to pick up on these things. And if you think about it, we rely so much on our schools to tell us these things because they're experts and they don't even see it. And so, try to be a little kinder to yourself. And we always say self-care is such an important part of parenting children too. So Julio asked, in your experience, do traditional private schools tend to shy away from children who have multiple challenges? So like ADHD and SPD at the same time.
Right. I can start, and maybe Lauren, or if anyone else has thoughts. I think the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. It depends on the child, it depends on the extent of the challenge, and most importantly, how much that shows up in the classroom, and frankly, how much of a disruption it is. It can almost even depend on the specific year and the ability of the specific teacher. So I think that generally so a couple things. There are a few schools that are intended for 2E kinds of kids, right? So this would be schools like Helios, the Burkhardt School, Tessellations, to some extent. They may not all say that they are 2E specific, but generally they will often take kids who have some challenges because they are founded with the understanding that with giftedness often comes some challenges, right? The asynchronous, back to the asynchronous development. Synapse, interestingly, was originally founded as a 2E school, and over the years has moved away from it. I think because it's tricky, right? Because I think schools, private schools say, you know, we would need people on site to help, right? Like learning difference specialists, and actually Synapse has a literacy center now for dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, et cetera. And they outsource like neuropsych assessments and that kind of thing. Some of the more traditional ones, I don't know that they would specifically come out and say it, but I think that in the admissions process, they are definitely screening for this. And anecdotally, in our experience and the experience of other friends who have gone through this process, oftentimes their kids will not get in, even if academically it's a clear fit, right? Because they're a little loath to take on some of the challenges. That being said, if you are upfront with it and you say, we're getting help, right? Like, for example, when we were applying to Synapse for my son, I said, well, you know, he's on medicine. We made that choice. It improves things for him. We have a therapist. We have a behaviorist who came in a few times and worked with the teacher. And I think they were more open to that, right? And they said, okay, like you're working with it, you're willing to work with us. So yeah, I don't know if that answers it completely, but that's been my experience.
I think something that you are saying that is really important is that if a parent expects that the school is going to be the place that would solve all the problems and would provide all the services, then that's not going to happen.
Right.
But if the parent come with the expectation that this is going to be, you know, teamwork, then there is a chance. Also, it really depends on how many kids with you know LDs are actually, you know, in that, you know, class. So there is just like they cannot have like 10 kids with, you know, ADHD at the same class. It's just not going to work.
Sure.
So it's just going to, you know, depend on who is signing up for their classes, who is already there, and how the parents are explaining what is like, you know, what is going on and what are they, you know, expecting from the teachers to do.
I totally agree.
Also wanted to add that I don't know who's here from looking at high schools, but there are several high schools on the peninsula that are that offer this kind of support. I mean, even interestingly, Menlo does offer support for kids with ADHD and dyslexia. They're a lot more rigorous, so your child would have to be able to handle the rigor. But there are schools like Kahila or Mid-Peninsula that are, their focus is to, they're not considered 2E schools per se, but they really do offer a lot of support for the kind of both the challenge as well as the support. I know Callie can talk to Mid-Peninsula more if anyone has questions about that.
So we have another question from Christina. Can you please list some assessors that specialize in finding 2E kids challenges and can explain them in depth? My kid completed IEE and we still don't have all the answers.
The independent educational evaluation.
So Christina, you're talking about neuropsych evaluators in particular?
Oh, this was for psychoeducational. I hope that helps. Psychoeducational assessment.
Okay.
So
So
he just got additional diagnosis of like related to his kind of hyperactivity, but then they weren't able to complete like the writing test, which he avoids like a plague. And so now I feel like there might be additional tests, like more just executive specific, not one of those like what I don't remember all the names, the WISC or whatever, which kind of talks about it but doesn't hone into into it more in depth, or like auditory processing, because there are some things like with him where he has extremely acute hearing, but then he kind of hears everything that a lot of people cannot catch in the room. So so I feel like our IE is incomplete, and obviously I contracted with the school, so that's probably part of the problem too.
yeah.
So
No, well, it sounds like perhaps, you know, like we were saying before, and Sharon was alluding to as well, it might be worthwhile considering a neuropsych assessment that would look more holistically at all of the kind of brain-based challenges, and would do things like the WISC, right? The IQ and giftedness testing. They would look at things like sensory challenges. They would look at formal diagnoses. And yeah, there are a number of places where, yeah, it's like it's a one-stop shop, and you would get that done over, you know, a certain amount of time as a process. Children's Health Council is one in Palo Alto. Morrissey Compton Educational Services is another one, and they also have some ongoing educational support that they provide to parents and schools as well. Abbey Neuropsychology is another big one that does evaluations. That's in Palo Alto. Sutcliffe Clinic is one in Los Altos. They run on the pricier side. Then there's also Summit Center. I think somebody mentioned before, Summit Center is particularly adept with twice exceptional kiddos, and they have evaluators who are really well versed in, you know, in children like that. So those are some of the big places. And there's also a whole like a plethora of individual psychologists who will do the assessments as well. Depending on where you live and kind of what you're hoping to get out of it. And the big ones may or may not, like I think CHC has a sliding scale option. If you talk to them, they'll do, you know, they'll have a 30-minute kind of free consultation to talk you through, here's what we might do, here's how we could help, etc. I'm not sure if all of the other places do, but yeah, that's something to consider.
and what about Child Mind Institute or something like that? Do they specialize in any of the like learning, like about assessing him for like auditory or for writing or comprehension or something like that? Or
So for the auditory processing, you could actually do that with, you know, audiologist, and then they would
oh my
tell
gosh,
you
I'm
if
so
you
new to all this. Like I don't know which one is like a doctor, insurance cover, and which one is like,
so
you know, more.
the way that you would start that is by meeting with either you know neuropsych or with an educational therapist, and they would be able to tell you which you know tests are going to be needed, because there are so many testing tools. There is just enormous amount, and no child needs to go through everything. So a neuropsych is going to choose the tools that are going to, you know, help you find the answers to the question that you are coming up with. So that's when the you know, interview and, you know, observations and talking to the parents, the teachers, and other people that, you know the child, and the child himself can, you know, help figure this out. If there is, you know, auditory processing issue, then there is a test that's called, you know, TAPS-4 that can be done. And after the TAPS-4, you know, audiologist is going to be the next thing to go to. If you can get that through your, you know, insurance, you could start there. You know, audiologist might say, this is not considered in my, like, this is not what I am supporting. This is more, you know, speech. So you would go to the speech therapist. It is a journey to figure out everything that is going on, is a journey.
So it's getting close to 8. It's a little past 8:30, and we were hoping to wrap up by around 8:30.
Thank you.
And there was just one question that I don't know about, and it's like a whole new area for us. And I don't know, Carmen and Lauren, if you know anything about this either. I feel like it's something that hasn't come up a lot in our group, and maybe something we all could learn a little bit about. But two questions that kind of connect to each other. I mean, Luby talked about, like you can get diagnoses for medical conditions like autism or ADHD. And there are some ways to get your health insurance to cover the testing for that. But you can't really get a diagnosis of 2E. And I just want to be clear about that, because that's not in the DSM-5. That's not covered medically. So like you will find that there are some neuropsychs and other evaluators, and we put some in the chat, and Carmen and Lauren have talked about some that actually understand twice exceptionality. It's just not something that's been called out yet medically. But but related to this is someone asked if they've been anyone has been able to use Cal-Able to pay for any of your expenses. And I think, Yael and I just aren't that familiar yet with how you can kind of tap into publicly available funds to pay for evaluation, diagnosis, and services. But I think it's an area we might like to cover more in the future, or present on more in the future. I don't know if you all have, Carmen or Lauren, have any resources on that, or if you want to also just kind of wrap up.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything specific to that. We do have also some additional lists of folks that are good and sort of tried and tested. And I think some other folks in the chat do as well. Like this is the way it goes a lot, right? Word of mouth. I think that's really important. And I would just encourage you to try a few people out. You can even just have a quick conversation and see what you think, see what their process is, see what they're willing to do with you, what they're willing to share with you, right? Not all reports are created equal either. So I just encourage you to think through that as you go through the evaluation process. But yeah, we're here if anybody's would like to get in touch with us. And we really appreciate the time tonight and the good questions, and good luck to everyone on your journeys. We're all still on our journeys. So
Thank you, Carmen and Lauren. Can you put
Thank
your emails into the chat so that if anybody here, wants to get in touch, if any of you want more specific, like you can talk to them about your specific child's needs and what you're looking for, and they will give you, a list of resources and really hold your hand through the process if you need that. So if you guys type in your contact information so people can get a hold of you.
Yeah.
And I am still trying to track down the name of this high school that opened in San Francisco that Dr. Melanie Hayes mentioned in our last event. And I don't know why I cannot find it. So I am going to stop the recording.
Okay.
And